Recently, the Central Kerbin Alliance Network discovered a second saucer, this one near the Mun South Pole. The Communists have thoroughly sanitized the site, leaving this lone marker revealing its fascist origins. What all have the Communists gleaned, and what will they do with this technology? I am Echo 3, and let's continue discussing the Cold War. Since the Communists do not appear to be an imminent threat, the Space Center will continue exploring the Kerbal system. The goal for this particular mission is to explore interplanetary space and do a flyby of the planet Eve. Eve is one of the closest planets to Kerbin, and as such requires very little delta V to reach. Matter of fact, it takes just a little bit more delta V to go to Eve than it does to Minmus. The goal for this mission is to gain as much science as possible from space high above Kerbal and space high and low above the planet Eve. The Communitron HG55 will be a strong enough antenna to keep the probe in constant contact with Kerbin. Since the antenna is a little bit more massive, other parts are placed off-center so that the center of thrust will remain in line with the center of mass. As the probe flies closer to Kerbal, the solar panels will become even more effective. And now, it's time to launch this humble probe into orbit around Kerbin. The Bobcat will give this probe a very high thrust-to-weight ratio, so it can be a little bit more aggressive on its gravity turn. The first stage will accelerate the craft about halfway to orbital velocity and over 20,000 meters. After MECO, the second stage will accelerate the craft to almost up to orbital velocity. From that point, the probe will do the rest of the work for the duration of the mission. Even though Eve is one of the closest planets to Kerbin, scientists remain fascinated with this purple object. It is covered in a very thick and cloudy atmosphere. Ground-based telescopes have not been able to see its surface. Once the probe reaches a stable orbit around Kerbin, engineers will double-check all of its systems while the probe waits for a transfer window before going to Eve. This will be the first probe to leave Kerbin's sphere of influence. About a week ago, 15 Kerbal Space Center recruits were sent up to the orbital lab. Upon the completion of their training, a few of them will become eligible to be Kerbalnauts for the Central Kerbin Alliance Network. But first things first, Valentina needs to fly the crew home. Valentina is flying the Central Kerbin Alliance Network's state-of-the-art shuttlecraft. She performed the deorbit burn about a quarter orbit away from the Space Center. By doing this, she should be able to glide the shuttle all the way back to the runway. Throughout the re-entry, Valentina adjusts the deployment of the vertical stabilizers to maintain the proper speed as she descends. As she approaches the western mountain range, she attempts to get her speed below 1,000 meters per second. As her speed drops below 1,000 meters per second, and her altitude dips below 15 kilometers, she points the nose down and heads in for the runway on the final approach. She is now within 17 kilometers and drops below Mach 1. She maintains about 10 degrees nose down all the way until she gets to the landing lights, where she will pull the nose up and flares the vertical stabilizers out to act as air brakes. That was some excellent flying, Valentina. Now that space camp has concluded, 3 of the trainees have been selected to join the ranks of the Kerbalnauts. And not a moment too soon, a Communist Sentry probe has disabled 3 Alliance crafts in orbit around the Mun. In order to meet this new challenge, the Alliance is launching a modified shuttle to the Mun. Part of the crew compartment has been removed and replaced with a weapons bay. Engineers have developed a new radar-guided missile that is able to operate in the vacuum of space. Rather than using traditional aerodynamic control surfaces, these missiles use RCS thrusters in order to maneuver. In addition to weapons, this shuttle also has a little extra fuel. Bill and Jebediah begin plotting an intercept course with the Communist Sentry. At this time, it's still unknown what weapon systems the Communist Sentry probe possesses. No matter how well armed the probe is, the Communists should not be expecting these new vacuum-capable missiles. Even though it appears that the Communists have concluded their investigation on the fascist vessel that they discovered, they have left all of their defenses active. This makes any mission to the Mun still very dangerous. Bill and Jebediah now perform their Mun injection burn. Once they are in a stable orbit around the Mun, they will begin plotting an intercept with a Communist probe. Jebediah sets up a retrograde maneuver so that on their second orbit, they will intercept the Communist probe. Since Jebediah and Bill intend to engage the target with missiles, they won't have to get too close for their intercept. Before completing the maneuver, Jebediah cancels it and just finishes the rendezvous by eye. As the two approach the probe, Jebediah moves the craft around to face it and turns on the radar. The probe must be very small. The radar is having a difficult time picking it up. Jebediah closes in on the target at 57 meters per second. At 17 kilometers, he opens the weapons bay. They continue closing in on the target. Around 10 kilometers away, Jebediah flips the craft around to perform a retrograde burn and slow down his velocity relative to the target. But in so doing, he must point his radar away from the target briefly. Future versions of the shuttle should probably have front and rear-facing radar. Jebediah slows down to 43 meters per second relative to the target, and then turns the craft back around to face it. As soon as Jebediah turns the craft around and has the radar face the probe again, the probe shows up on the radar. Jebediah attempts to lock onto the target and fires a missile. The first missile zips towards the target, but doesn't hit. The probe appears to be armed with a couple sets of 12.7mm cannons. Jebediah again attempts to reduce his velocity relative to the target. After doing that, he again flips his craft around to face the target in an attempt to regain radar contact. Jebediah now releases a second missile. As the distance between the two crafts decreases, the Kommunist probe begins firing at Jebediah and Bill. Jebediah fires his remaining two missiles. The missiles are struggling to hit the target. With no other weapons at their disposal, Jebediah and Bill need to move on and attempt to rescue the stranded Kerbals. They alter their course slightly so that they will rendezvous with the closest Kerbal. As Jeb is plotting his maneuvers, the Kommunist probe is still firing at them. The probe doesn't have any radar and is struggling to make accurate hits on the shuttle. Jebediah and Bill are now attempting to maneuver over to the closest stranded Kerbal. Just as they did with their engagement with the Kommunist probe, they will reduce their relative velocity. But in this case, it will make it easier for the stranded Kerbal to EVA over to them. As the distance closes to less than 1 kilometer, the stranded Kerbal gets out of his pod and begins making his way over to the shuttle. Tim begins carefully making his way over to the passenger hatch. As Tim closes in with the shuttle, he slows down so he doesn't smash himself, and he's able to quickly grab onto the shuttle and enter. Once Tim is in, Jebediah begins altering his orbit in order to go out to the next stranded Kerbal. Jebediah raises his apoapsis out to the target's descending node. Then, at his apoapsis, Jebediah plots the rendezvous burn. Since the stranded Kerbal is at a slightly different inclination, this will be a prograde and a normal burn combined together. After conducting the burn, the shuttle will have a closest approach with the target of around 300 meters. Jebediah continues to refine his orbit so that the closest approach will now be less than 100 meters. This will make it very easy for the stranded Kerbal to EVA over to the shuttlecraft. The Kerbal exits their pod, targets the shuttle, and begins doing an EVA over to the shuttlecraft. Like Tim, the Kerbal must target the hatch on the top of the shuttle. And they fly right to the hatch and grab on and are able to board easily. That's the first two, but there is still one more Kerbal to save. The last Kerbal is in a retrograde orbit. So Jebediah first raises his apoapsis at the target's descending node. From here, he will reverse his orbit and match inclination with the target. In addition to that, he will also raise his periapsis out to the same height as the target. Now that the shuttle's orbit intersects the stranded Kerbal's orbit, they can plot a rendezvous course. And if you are enjoying this video, don't forget to activate the like button. Jebediah pilots the shuttle again for a very close intercept. While in target mode, Jebediah burns on the target side of the retrograde marker in order to reduce the relative velocity and the craft separation. Now that the two crafts are within a couple hundred meters, the Kerbal gets out and begins making their way towards the shuttle. With the last Kerbal on board, Jebediah plots his maneuver back to Kerbin. This has been a lot of maneuvering for Jebediah. He's probably feeling tired at this point. On longer duration missions, the Alliance should look at sending 2 pilots. Jebediah ejects the shuttle from the Munn sphere of influence and drops the shuttle's periapsis to be inside of Kerbin's atmosphere. It appears that Jebediah is a little fatigued, and he ends up flying over the Space Center and will land in the water to its east. The shuttle isn't designed for landing in the water, but it is able to glide very well. Jebediah keeps a careful eye on his vertical speed. Not only does he want to keep his surface speed very low, he wants to keep his vertical speed extremely low as he touches down on the water. It's not on the runway, but nothing broke. Good job, crew. After the long mission, the 5 Kerbals report to the astronaut complex for some R&R. An EVE transfer window has now opened up. Engineers have plotted an ejection burn for the EVE probe. The craft's ejection burn will get it very close to EVE's sphere of influence, but not inside, so a mid-course correction burn will be needed. Once the craft has ejected from Kerbin's sphere of influence, engineers plot a correction burn at the descending node. The correction burn will adjust the craft's orbit so that it will skim just above EVE's atmosphere. In order to gather science from space low above EVE, the craft needs to be below 400 kilometers. So in order to maximize the amount of time to gather science, engineers plot a course that is well below 400 kilometers. As the craft zips out towards its maneuver, it looks like engineers messed up on the timing just a little bit and overshot their burn, but in interplanetary space, burns don't have to be quite as precisely timed. The craft now enters space high above EVE and begins conducting a variety of scientific experiments, including Mystery Goo, Science Junior, and Magnetometer. With the first experiments complete, the probe transmits its data back to Kerbin. All of this scientific data will help the Central Kerbin Alliance Network advance technologically. The craft then conducts all the same experiments in low space over EVE. As the craft passes on the day side of EVE, it briefly loses radio contact with Kerbin. In order to maintain a radio connection for the entire time, the Central Kerbin Alliance Network would need to set up some kind of relay network around EVE. A relay network is something the Alliance should consider anywhere they intend to conduct surface operations. Back at the Space Center, the Alliance upgrades the astronaut complex and the Research and Development building. Scientists at the Research and Development facility report they have developed a new engine capable of extremely fast flight. With this new technology, engineers are attempting to build a Mach 3 capable spy plane. And, due to a comment I received recently, this will be a flying wing design. The last time the Alliance sent a spy plane over the Dessert Airfield, the Communists were able to engage it with their anti-aircraft defenses. This jet should fly far too high and too fast for the Communists to have any chance of engaging it. And, due to some interesting research conducted by Kerbal engineers, flying wing designs tend to have a reduced radar cross-section. All of these factors should greatly increase the craft's survivability, and, by extension, the Kerbal that's flying it. The secret to maintaining stability on a flying wing design like this are the air brakes mounted on the sides. The air brakes are given yaw control authority, and with SAS enabled, they will keep the craft stable. The last thing to add are the mission-specific spy plane parts. A high-resolution camera is installed on the underside of the craft. In addition to taking pictures, it is also able to relay targeting information. DD engages the powerful jet engines and takes off. After turning the craft around to head west, within seconds, DD is able to accelerate over Mach 1. This is an extremely powerful craft. DD will have to be careful to make sure that he doesn't melt his wings off. At 7,000 meters, the craft has already exceeded Mach 3. In order to qualify for the record though, DD will need to level the plane out. With the craft handling so well, Command gives the authorization to send the craft over to the Dessert Airfield. At 21,000 meters and over Mach 3, DD is very safe from Communist weapons. DD activates his camera and focuses in on the airfield. What is this? It looks like the Communists are building their own saucer based on the fascist design. This could pose a very serious threat to the Alliance. I am Echo 3, and thanks for joining me on this discussion about the Cold War. I will see you next time.